This is sixth session. We've had intro, we had how to do your own EUI on your house. We went through insulation, air sealing, mechanical systems, electric hot water, electric cooking, and tonight's session with Malcolm is going to be PV, batteries, and EV charging. All of these Aaron has posted on the studio website. So if you have time and you want to go back and watch a bunch of sessions on electrification, they're all online. So a lot of people have joined these sessions, have different goals for their homes. Some people want to make it net zero, some want to get off fossil fuels, some want to reduce overall energy consumption and reduce their carbon footprint. So we've been looking at all different ways to incrementally electrify homes and buildings. So on the left, that's Malcolm Sonnet. Malcolm will be taking over in a bit. He is Malcolm's company, Revision Energy, is working with us on a few projects, and he has been great in terms of explaining complicated things to myself and my teams about how it works. And so I'm going to turn it over to Malcolm. Thanks.
Thanks for the kind words, Nick. So a little bit of agenda. We are going to cover basically, as in the past sessions, Nick's covered electrification of the home. And now we take it to basically looking at the power plant of the home for those that wish to further their carbon footprint reduction by powering their home on renewables. So just a quick aside there, PV stands for photovoltaic. So shorthand way of saying solar. I think probably most of you who are interested in this already knew that, but
yeah, we'll also be stopping at each session, at each part for questions. So feel free to put your questions in the chat box, or as Malcolm goes through sections, we'll stop and we can ask questions. And we can also ask questions at the end as well.
Perfect.
Ready to go forward, Malcolm?
Yes, please. Yeah. So as Nick mentioned, I'm with Revision Energy. We are leading Northern New England's transition to renewable energy. We're primarily known as a solar company, but we like to think of ourselves as a clean energy transition company. So we design and install solar, heat pumps, heat pump water heaters, electric vehicle chargers, and battery backup. So there's this way that this ties in really nicely, electrifying the home and then powering it all with essentially free energy hitting your roof. So some considerations for solar design. I mean, it all starts with the site, basically the roof orientation, so the direction relative to south, the pitch, and of course the shade or lack thereof, ideally. We'll also talk about kind of how solar panels are sized with some of the utility rules. So we're going to be talking about, these are all grid-tied systems. We don't do any off-grid work, and really it's beneficial to be tied to the grid for a couple of reasons. So we'll talk about that. We'll talk about future proofing, which again is back to electrification and sizing the home for future reduction of fossil fuel usage through the adoption of electric heating and other appliances. And then aesthetics, of course, because some of you might be planning to build a new house. You want it to look good. How do you incorporate solar and make it look really slick? So that's the brief coverage there for the PV topic. You can go to the next slide, Nick. So I'd like to start here just for, why solar? You can see on the right-hand side, this is the world's finite energy reserves that we know of in the different forms: coal, uranium, petroleum, natural gas. And then the various renewable sources. In the far left there in the orange is the world's energy use per year. And then of course, dwarfed by all of that is the potential of energy that hits the earth every year coming from the sun. So that's what we are trying to capture. And this to me just kind of puts in perspective, why are we pursuing solar and not nuclear, for example? So it's just this abundant resource that's hitting sunshine, that's hitting rooftops everywhere. Let's capture it. Go to the next slide, Nick. So to kind of illustrate this visually and start getting into orientation and some of the site parameters that I touched on. So whenever you look at a satellite map, you're looking north-south. So south being the bottom of the page. These are two images from a pretty neat website called Google Project Sunroof. And just illustrating the concept here, where you can see on the left, you've got kind of a downtown and that's very shade free, which is why all those buildings are very sunny. And then you've got kind of shady residential areas, and you can see a lot of purple. So trying to use the colors here to be self-explanatory, that a bright white or bright yellow roof is high solar potential, and purple probably not worth the investment. And then on the right, you can see a little more closely illustrated in detail a typical residential neighborhood that does get a little bit more sun. And you can see where the south half of a simple gable roof is bright yellow and the north side being purple. So there's the first piece of this, orientation relative to south. You always want a roof pitch to be as close to south as possible. A few percentage off is not a big deal, not a deal breaker. The real deal breaker is the shading. So we look at orientation relative to south, tilt, about 35 degrees is optimal for annual production. And then, of course, we want to be as shade-free as possible. You can go to the next slide, Nick. So we're going to use this Weston project that Nick and I worked on as a case study, as an example of a new construction. We'll get into the shade here in a minute. New construction in a shaded residential area. Here's a simple mock-up where we know from the architectural plans how many panels can fit based on roof size. So we're doing some math and we're figuring out square footage of roof area. We're looking at number of panels that can fit. In this case, a very large array, 32 kilowatt solar array. So that's the nameplate rating. You take that nameplate rating, and then based on the site conditions, we get an annual kilowatt hour or energy production over the course of the year. So this was 76 panels across 3 subarrays, 2 on the roof, 1 on a pavilion. And so the pavilion was a nice asset because at a 35-degree pitch and kind of set back from the shading, that was really the best roof available. And then, as I mentioned, grid tied system. So this is using what's called net metering with the grid, where there's a meter that can basically go forward and backwards. And so what's great about that is the occupant doesn't have to change their habits at all. You can do all your laundry in the middle of the night, run the oven in the middle of the night, charge your car in the middle of the night, and basically go on vacation during the day and turn all your lights off. And all of that solar production happening during the day is going to spin your meter backwards, earn you a credit, and then pull at night. So this is happening on a monthly basis. The rules vary from utility to utility, but that's the basic concept. We want to be a grid tied system. Solar is supplementing what is being used from the grid and ideally offsetting as much as possible. You can go to the next slide, Nick. So we start with a shading analysis. On the left there is an image from what's called a sun eye. It's basically like a gigantic calculator with a fisheye lens. And what you're seeing in that image is what a roof sees looking south. So in the lines at the top, December, January, February, the sun is lowest in the sky, and you can tell it's skirting into those trees, shaded in green. So that's shading happening during the winter months. And then the sun is rising higher in the sky, April, May, June, virtually no shading from 8 a.m. to 6 p.m. So everything there in yellow is basically the solar potential over the course of a year. And that's going to vary from roof plane to roof plane. So as you can see, we can take a sun eye reading on multiple roof planes, and that's what's superimposed in the right-hand image, showing the potential for every kilowatt of solar on that roof, how many kilowatt hours can we expect in the course of a year? So we're doing this analysis, and we're doing Tetris on how many panels can fit and where they should optimally go to maximize solar production and maximize the investment. So you can see the two southernmost roof planes are the best after the pavilion. So the pavilion is the best spot there in the back left corner. And then we fill in around where it makes the most sense. You can go to the next slide, Nick. So as it relates to electrification, we can look at a baseline electric usage. So Nick's team does an analysis on what are the lighting loads, what are the cooking loads, what are the entertainment loads, and those are outlined in dark blue. Those are what I call the baseline loads, and those are typically fairly small in the grand scheme of things. What is really electrically intensive is when heating is electrified and when hot water usage is electrified, electric vehicle charging or transportation is electrified. So that's outlined in the light blue to kind of show how much more those things add to the electric bill. And then the line in yellow is showing solar production over the course of the year. So you can see solar production dwarfs usage in most of the summer months, spring through September. And that's where that net metering comes in, the interaction with the utility, which is actually quite a positive thing, because all of that surplus is now going to neighbors and providing clean energy to the grid during those peak times, earning the owner a credit, which then can be used to make up the deficit in November, December, January, as you can see there on the grid. So all in all, this project, the goal is electrification anyway. The goal is reduction of carbon footprint, and there's an ROI on it. So there's a, with renewables, there is an ROI on clean energy, which is pretty cool. Next slide, please, Nick. I see there are a few people just joining us, so we'll stop here in a minute for questions on the solar piece. So I also like to touch on aesthetics. Solar can look really good, but, contrary to some beliefs out there, especially if it's planned from the beginning, working with an architect to find out what roof planes are available. Can we tweak rafter lengths to get a nice, neat grid? Can we avoid dormers on the south facing side, that sort of thing. You can go to the next slide, Nick. There's a couple of these. So the end result, getting hopefully a very pleasing looking array that is also functional. You can go to the next slide, Nick. And again, kind of bringing it full circle. So how greenhouse gas emissions are reduced based on grid electricity being cleaned up. So you can see on the left there's your typical heating sources and their pounds of CO2 emission. And then on the right, this isn't even 100% renewable energy on the grid. This is just 12%, which is about what Massachusetts has. So you can see how greatly diminished the CO2 emissions are, just from 12% of the grid being renewable. Next slide. And we show this on all of our proposals to kind of put a worldwide perspective on it, and then a New England perspective on it, and then a local per capita individual project perspective to show kind of how a certain project might reduce your emissions. I think that might be it for PV. We go to the next slide, Nick. Yeah, so we'll pause there for questions on PV. I see some in the chat. It might be easier if you're bold enough to just unmute yourself and ask a question. But I will try to look through and read some questions here.
There's a question here on grid source and PV on roof, Malcolm. So switching between the grid source and the PV on the roof. Do you want to get to that when we go through batteries, or do you want to talk about that now?
Yeah, I think that will tie in there. I see this, Axel, if you hold that question till after the batteries, I think hopefully it'll become self-explanatory. We're talking grid tied systems, and then here we'll talk about how batteries kind of change that.
Malcolm, there's a question here. So in Newton, there's now a renewable energy power choice. You can choose to opt in where you're buying your energy. So why would somebody want to put solar on the roof still if they're already buying it from the grid?
That's a great question. So Massachusetts has, I'll try to stay out of the weeds a little bit. Massachusetts has deregulated energy supply, which means that if your utility, which you can't choose, your designated one, Eversource, for example, you don't have to pick Eversource's default supplier. You can shop around for a third-party supplier. You can source 100% renewable energy that on paper is, wind from Kansas. So that's a great way to say, hey, look, all of my energy in my house is coming from a renewable source somewhere. Putting solar on your house has, in my eyes, two advantages. One, you're bringing that production closer to home. You're employing a local company to do that installation. And you're keeping that on the Massachusetts grid. And then two, you are earning in the case of a supplier, you're paying a little bit of a premium to clean up your energy use. With solar, you are eventually earning a return on that investment that far beats continuing to pay the utility. Hope that answers the question. Jim Horowitz, what kind of capacity battery was used? We'll get into that. Any examples of BIPV? That's existed for a long time. Dow, that makes shingles. They've had building mounted, or building, what's the I? Incorporated photovoltaics. So I think you're asking about kind of solar shingles, which Tesla is trying to develop. Haven't really gotten to prime time quite yet. There's a number of disadvantages to mounting solar panels flat to a roof, primarily access, service, and then venting. Panels like being cool. They like the natural venting that you get when they're mounted, 4 inches from the roof plane. How are we doing on time?
No, let's go to the batteries and we can take a few more questions.
Okay. All right, so considerations for a storage design. So storage is not mandatory. You can have standalone solar. What a battery allows you to do is basically think of a battery as being analogous to a generator. So because a grid-tied solar array is getting the benefit of the push-pull with the grid, and as I mentioned, no habits have to change, what a battery lets you do is, because a solar array is forced to shut down when the grid goes down, and the reason for that is just safety, so that you don't have solar backfeeding the grid and electrocuting linemen as it's being repaired. So when the grid goes out, solar goes out. So a battery is a way to step in, sever the connection to the grid, and then let the home run on the combination of solar plus battery. So you have this ever-moving puzzle where the house is being powered by the solar, if there's enough solar, the battery, if there isn't enough solar, and the solar is recharging the battery. So you can have all these pieces happening to power your home loads. So some considerations for storage design: the sizing. There's some things to pay attention to. You can't have an enormous solar array funneled into a small battery. That's really the extent of it. You can go vice versa to your heart's content. Winter heat. So again, heating being a third to half of our energy use is very electrically intensive when the switch is made to electrification for heating. And that's typical, and wintertime is when the solar production is lowest. So we have to be very careful about what we're trying to, being very careful about backing up heating with a backup battery and solar in winter with panels covered in a foot of snow. There's some considerations with service sizing. So a lot of the homes that Nick and others are going to be building that are all electric are going to have a large service, a 400 amp service. Most, I would say all, there's some forthcoming products, but right now the biggest transfer switches that will switch from grid to battery are only rated for 200 amps. There's some fire code issues that that dictate where batteries can be installed in the home. Think about generator integration. And then load management is the biggest one, sort of related to winter heat, but all the different loads in the house, how to manage them. You can go ahead, Nick. So just a high level to hit some stats for this case study in Weston. Again, this was a project using 5 Tesla Powerwalls for a total of 25 kilowatt peak output. Sorry, continuous power output, capacity of 67.5 kilowatt hours. So what that amounted to in this home, based on the loads that we're going to be running in wintertime, it amounted to about 35 hours of backup duration, with really no sacrifices to lifestyle, and that's with no solar input. So that's how long the batteries can run the home with 2 feet of snow covering the panels. And the way that we made this work even better is the heat pump for heating. The heating system was broken up into multiple outdoor units, which lets us zone off and say, this part of the house we don't need during an outage. Here's the core of the house. Let's make sure that has heat. There also happen to be 2 fireplaces, which is a great way to elongate duration in an outage by having a different form of heating. And then on the flip side, so that's sized for winter. On the flip side, near infinite backup in summertime, because even air conditioning isn't as big of a load as heating, and it's certainly not essential if it needs to be dropped. And then so basically infinite runtime in summer too. So this project also had a smart load center rather than a typical electric panel. Is made by a company called Span. We'll get into that. And this had a 400 amp service split into 2 200 amp main panels, which let us choose one to back up and then one to shed completely in an outage. You can go to the next slide, please, Nick. So that project used Tesla Powerwalls. There are many choices out there. Another one we tend to like is Generac. Generac does it a little bit differently. They have kind of a whole ecosystem. They have a way for their generators to integrate directly into the batteries for recharging. You can go to the next slide. So just to quickly touch again on this Span panel, pretty neat. So a typical electric panel is not smart in any way. The Span panel has an intelligent breaker system. They're standard breakers, but they're all connected through the web to a mobile app that not only is showing the consumption of each circuit in the home, so how much your dishwasher is using and the lighting circuit, et cetera, but also being able to remotely toggle those circuits on or off and set programs such that an entire number of circuits can be shut off in the event of an outage, basically on a schedule. So power goes out, shed all of these loads, and then they can be manually turned on as desired. So that's great for things like, a hot tub. If you can't shed it completely by design, then you can control it in a way that it has a default setting that it will go off in an outage, and only on that sunny day would you turn it back on. Next slide, please, Nick. So here's a closer look at some of the features of that app and the resolution you can get on seeing not only the consumption to the left, but also toggling the circuits and setting profiles. Next slide. And then just a little bit about electric vehicle charging. So you've probably heard of level 1, level 2, level 3. So level 1 charging is really not much different than it's going to be a default charger that comes with every electric car, and it's a very low wattage charger. It's only going to use 120 volt standard household outlet, about 4 to 5 miles of range per hour, depending on vehicle. Level 2 charging is what almost everyone would have in their home who's serious about charging. So that's going to use a 240 volt circuit. Depending on the amperage of that circuit, can charge even a big SUV overnight. And then level 3 charging, you're not going to see in homes. Level 3 charging is what you're going to find at the gas stations, rest stops, and select places around towns. So here's sort of an example. This would be a level 2 charger that's Wi-Fi connected, so you can track. So this is as part of the electrification of the home. This is a great addition. You're electrifying your transportation, even if you don't have an electric vehicle today. That's what everybody's next car is going to be shortly. And so that goes back to future-proofing the design, is planning for something like that that is virtually inevitable. All right, stop for questions there on batteries.
A question early on from Bob. He's saying he's interested in storage in his basement. He has solar panels on his roof. So Malcolm, how do you start the conversation with batteries when clients want to look at them? How does that begin?
So one of the first bullet points is the sizing. So as I mentioned, Bob, if you have a massive solar array, that will dictate the size of the batteries, because they have to be sized big enough to accept that solar charge. You mentioned your basement. One thing I didn't touch on fully there is the fire code in Massachusetts right now, and hopefully this changes, but any battery capacity bigger than 20 kilowatt hours is going to need to be in a 1 hour fire separated room or enclosure from the residence. So you saw a photo there of batteries in a garage. Every garage by code needs to be separated from the main residence by 5/8 drywall. That amounts to a 1 hour fire rating. So that's why you're going to see multiple power walls, because they exceed that threshold. You're going to see those installed in a garage. So it depends on the size you're looking for, Bob. 20 kilowatt hours and below can be installed in a basement, an unfinished basement, as long as there's no living space down there.
Malcolm, there's a question. If there's no garage, is there any problem with an outdoor level 2 charger and approximate cost?
Yeah, no problem with that. I think you had it on a slide there, Nick, towards the end. They can be pedestal mounted. Pedestal mounted is going to typically mean a short trench to a pedestal. So trenching costs can vary tremendously depending. The units themselves, if you can, let's see, if no garage. So depending on the electric run from your main panel to an exterior wall that you want to mount this on, if you can avoid a pedestal, you're talking maybe $1,000, $2,000 in electrical work to get it there. And then these chargers vary depending on their features, but typically these are, and any homeowner can buy these themselves for $500 to $1,000. Somebody had a good point there about vehicle to grid, and that pointing out that you can park 2 60-kilowatt-hour cars in a garage. That's exactly right. That's part of the silliness of the fire code, but I won't go down that road. Vehicle to grid is very interesting. The F-150 Lightning is raising some questions, the new Ford F-150, because they're talking about bidirectional charging. Those chargers are likely going to be very expensive to the point that they sort of replace a battery, but but certainly possibilities. Everything is going to depend on how manufacturers work with the warranties of, warranting a vehicle is one thing, warranting a vehicle that's being used as a home battery is sort of a little bit different. Yeah, good point, Drew. These chargers are really just, for lack of a better word, an extension cord. And then the management of the charging of the battery inside the car is happening within the car's guts.
All right, Malcolm, I'm going to go to this next section. Thanks for the, so just a few things. So our team, we work with Malcolm's team early in our projects. And just if you're a homeowner and you're considering this, we just, we wanted to give people a framework. So I'm going to go through a little bit of what our process is early on. So when we're looking at a new house or renovation, we're learning a lot. The electrification, the products are changing a lot. The codes are changing. This is, we're going to be working on this the rest of our lives. So like, there's a lot to learn. But I'd encourage anybody who's considering this to really, I'm going to show you a spreadsheet in the next slide, really to look at assembling a team. So who's going to be working on the systems and really try to assign roles and responsibilities. Where we have run into issues on some projects, not with Malcolm's team, but with other teams, is not having a clear delineation of roles and responsibilities. So, we want to have a solar point person, a battery point person, an EV charging point person. And I'll show you some of this is a picture of one of our houses that we're building. And all these electric components, there's actually 3 companies that are working on this system. So there's 3 span panels off to the left here. You've got some inverters here, and we've got 3 different companies working on this project. And so we try to divide up the work early on and make sure we're clear who owns which connections, and if there's an issue, or how do we know what the issue is, and how do we know if it's working. So this is just a slide Malcolm and I were working on earlier today, sort of thinking about how do we, like when we look at the components, how do we determine who takes it? And so one of the first components we're always looking at with all these systems is, you're probably going, if you have 100 amps, you're definitely going to 200. And if you have 200 and you want to add more, you're probably going to 400 amps. So initiating a permanent service right now takes us about a year. So we want to start that process really early on. Typically the electrician starts that process, and they're dealing with the utility company to begin that. So if you're considering this, you want to research with them, find a good electrician, and then have them engage the utility company. If you have an existing house and you're just upgrading your service, it doesn't take as long. But if you're building a new house, it takes a long time. And just so you know, 400 amp services are very hard to come by right now. So like, I think there's a supply chain shortage of 400 amp meter sockets. The next thing that we look at when we're managing our teams is putting in conduits. So if we're not sure which components our clients are going to put in, or where these components, we want to have, it's cheap to run PVC conduit. It's harder to pull wires later on. So we're typically going to look at where do all the conduits, what are we thinking about connecting, and where do we put the piping for that? We'll typically go through the PV conduit with the PV installer. We're going to review the locations with them before wiring starts, and we're going to install these conduits when we're working on our framing work. There's no commissioning and there's no monitoring of the conduits. The next component is putting in conduits for future connections. So a lot of our projects, we're trying to think, when the technology changes 10 years from now, how do we connect new wires to these components? So as a builder, we're reviewing potential conduit locations, and we're just trying to think, typically we're thinking going from the basement of the building to the attic, and then we're thinking, how do we move horizontally across a building so that we can get from one end of the building to the other if they want to add something at a later date. So if you're a homeowner, you're thinking about this, think about conduits. I'm sorry. The next thing is we're going to identify the PV panels. So that's the photovoltaic panels. With Malcolm's company, we just deal with Malcolm or one of his teammates. But we're going to review the locations and approve the racking system very early on. So depending on the type of roofing you're looking at, we definitely have to look at what is the racking system. So like if we have a rubber roof, or if we have a metal roof or an asphalt roof, we have to think about how are we getting the connection back into the building, and how many holes are we putting in our roof to get there. And then in terms of once that's installed, which is typically at the very end of the project, the PV goes on because we don't want the panels getting damaged during construction. How do we know if that system's working? And Malcolm's company and some of the other PV companies use Enphase, or Malcolm, this other company I haven't used, but you recommended them, Solar Edge. They have a system to monitor the systems to tell you if it's working or if there's an issue. So you know, a lot of these components, once it's in and the people are done from the job site, how do you as a homeowner know if it's working? You would have an app or a login to one of those monitoring systems. The PV inverter, that's taking the energy from the photovoltaic and that's connecting it to the house or to the batteries. We're also going to need to locate that. You need to have room in your mechanical room for these components, and that goes through the same process as the PV, and that is also monitored, so you can find out if your inverter is working. Okay, so next slide. So next component we have is storage. Typically with storage, we're going to work with our PV installer to put those in. There's different companies. Some electricians do batteries. We're going to review the location of the batteries. We're going to look at what's the fire code for those, and are we meeting the clearance requirements? You have to be a certain distance from water. You have to be a certain distance from drain cleanouts. So you have to make sure that your battery location is going to meet the local codes. And we're going to review that before we run any wires. We're going to determine exactly where those batteries are going to end up. And how do you know if those systems are working once they're installed? Tesla and Generac have their own apps which can tell you if the systems are working. But there's what you're finding with a lot of this stuff is you're going to be on a lot of different platforms, so you have to be prepared. It's easier to have one company like Malcolm's company that does all of these things, and you can call them with one question. Whereas if you have 5 different companies doing all these components and you have an issue, it gets trickier. So we recommend Revision because they specialize in all of these components. The battery transfer switch, so battery ATS, this is another component you need to have room for. So if you look back at that photo I showed in the earlier slide, we located all of this stuff before we ran our plumbing piping and before we started building, so we didn't run out of room in the mechanical room. Then you have your main electrical panel. So electrician is typically going to install the electrical panel, unless it's a smart panel, a span IO panel, then you could have a span installer. But a lot of times with all these all-electric homes, we have multiple sub panels. So we have like a main panel and we have sub panels. And what we try to do early is identify what is on the critical loads, what do you need to during a storm when the power goes out, and what can you live without. And then we try to separate those panels and we can locate them in different parts of the building. And how do you know if those are installed? Those are typically just being inspected by your local inspector. So there's really no, we don't typically monitor the actual panel. If you do a span IO panel, you have the app and you can see all your circuits, and there's a way to monitor how the panel works. But with our traditional panels, they're not smart components. They're just standard breakers. So the span IO panel, we're actually working with Revolution. They're the company that's the local span rep doing those. They're working with Malcolm's team to integrate this, and they're working with our electrician. So span is a spin-off from Tesla, and we think it's interesting. It's a much cleaner way to monitor your energy, your circuits on a very granular level. And then if you have an EV charger, you're going to have electricians typically going to install that. We're going to review the locations. We're going to look at what sort of wiring we need, where we need to get it to. And those also have apps that you can use to download on your phone, and you can see if it's working or not working. But so there's a lot of components. We just sort of made this sheet to sort of show you, like, in some clients, we really like having all the technology and having multiple apps. great. You don't have to monitor these things, but as a builder, we like the apps because we want to know that what we're putting in is working. And if there's an issue, we want to be able to figure it out quickly. So the apps give us access for troubleshooting. Any questions on this? Going into other chat questions in the chat box. So we can take more questions. I just wanted to, this is the last of our electrification series. We are going to be starting a 4-part series in the springtime called Building for Biodiversity with Elise Bernstein. She's an environmental science student who's helping us put together a 4-part series looking at biodiversity, and part of it will also be looking at electrification in the yard. I'll be looking at, in this different seasons, what are some electrification practices you can use to get fossil fuels out of your landscape practices? So in winter, spring, summer, fall. Malcolm, thanks for making the time. If the people have other questions, Malcolm, I don't know if you want to put your email in the chat box.
Absolutely, yeah. Thanks, everybody. That was, I hope that was helpful. Some good questions, good discussion.
Yeah, Sue asked, can I watch this after today? Yes, all of these sessions are posted on the studio website. So just go to studiohpdc.org. So thank you for joining us. And if you have other questions, we can stay on for a couple minutes. Otherwise, get some rest. Oh.
Question?
Yep.
Could you address the economics of the storage battery? You know, how much does it cost, and is it really money you never get back, but you do it because you want to have the insurance of power?
Yeah, it's helpful to think of it just like a generator, you know, similarly, right? There's no economic proposition for a generator other than, you know, I don't know, you could tally up how much wasted food in a freezer that goes, that, you know, where all the food goes bad. You can kind of tally up that way. But what's interesting about a battery is you can, so if you compared it to an automatic whole home generator, which it really is, it's not a, you know, a few $100 plug-in generator. It's not on that level. It's analogous to a whole home automatic generator. If you look at 10-year costs, you're probably spending less over that time on a battery system that does the equal amount of work. So typical, just numbers I'm most familiar with, a 2 Powerwall system is probably in the $25,000 to $30,000 initial investment. You've got a large tax credit of 26%, may go up to 30% if some legislation passes. And then you have a number of, depending on your utility, you have a number of programs you can participate in where you can share your battery with the grid at times you don't need it. So this is times when you are grid connected, and the grid and the utilities can actually pay you for your help in shaving the demand for everyone. And yeah, so that's bringing your net investment to easily under $10,000 over 10 years, meaning, and meanwhile, a whole home automatic generator, you know, I don't know off the top of my head, but call it 10,000 plus fuel expenses over its life in that same period.
Yeah, and the other consideration, the other consideration, so these 5 Powerwalls are replacing a 30 kilowatt gas generator. So, you know, we have the cost of that generator, we have the gas piping for that generator, plus all the gas that thing's going to use because it runs every week for 20 minutes, right?
Right.
So all of that, like, you know, when you factor it in, you know, it's right now, it's, somebody just commented, it's much more, the batteries for your house are much more money than the batteries for your car. And hopefully eventually that will change. But like Malcolm said, over time, you're getting these other uses out of it. And so, you know, I like we've been recommending to a lot of clients too, is that you don't have to back up the whole house. You just have to back up enough to run another energy source. Like a gas fireplace is like a cheap way to heat a house during a power outage. And you don't need a lot of electricity to power a gas fireplace. So you can have a small battery with a small gas backup as we move away from fossil fuels, I think gas is a good way to back up homes in New England, not the primary heat source, but a backup heat source. So most homes, we're not backing up the whole house like with 5. We might just put in 1 or 2 batteries.
And it's certainly a little bit easier with the new build, especially the type that Nick's company does, where they're, incredibly well insulated. You can get so far off just a small single fireplace where that heat is circulating around the whole house through ventilation and things.
There's a question here, does it make sense to draw on your battery when there isn't a power outage, like at night?
It depends on your utility, and it depends on some nuances about the size. But there is no financial advantage if you have a 1-to-1 net metering agreement with your utility. So you're pushing and pulling, and it makes no difference when you use it or when you're producing surplus that's going back to the grid and earning you a credit. But if you live in one of the municipalities, one of the municipal light departments, if that's your utility, they typically have pretty piss poor net metering arrangements. And so it makes sense to try to, you can program your battery. That's one of the beautiful things about it. You can set a profile and it will it'll go into 0 export mode. It'll try to keep as much energy, it'll try to keep you self-sustaining as much as possible. And you do no harm to your batteries. They can handle that flattening and recharging, tens of thousand times.
So Malcolm, what about, and from a not financial perspective, but what if somebody says, well, I want to use the energy I make on my house is like the site energy, it's available site energy. Can we set this up? So say we wanted to run this, is there an argument to be made that you can use much more site energy on site with the batteries, because you can charge the batteries during the day and then use it at nighttime? So you're not pulling from the grid if you're pulling from the grid where there's not renewable energy available?
Right. There's an argument to just keeping your own clean electrons in your house. I mean, we find a lot of our customers, there's no financial advantage, but they do it anyway because of that feeling of, hey, everything on my roof is going into my batteries and being used at night. But again, if you have 1-to-1 net metering, there's no financial advantage, right? It's like, I compare it to a garden. If you grow your own food, I grow my own tomatoes. I don't grow all my own tomatoes. I still have to supplement from the grocery store. My ability to can them and save some for later in the year does nothing for reducing what I still have to buy. So I can only grow what I can grow. The fact that I can store it for later doesn't reduce anything that I still have to supplement, if that makes sense. We've got Axel with a hand up there. Axel, you might have to unmute. Oh, there you go.
Yep. So we don't have a new house. We have a house that was built in 1929, and we've done a lot of insulation through Mass Save. But what's intimidating about this whole process is, as you so nicely pointed out earlier, you're working with all sorts of contractors to do all of this, and that's one point that I have that's confusing about how to integrate that, and I guess that's part of what revision is about. The second point that's related to that is that, as you pointed out I guess it's the first of this series, the thing, if you're retrofitting a house, you've really got to look at the container. And so this is the first point of analysis that somebody like me has to think about. Is that the starting place that you're recommending, that kind of analysis?
Yeah, we typically just tell people, if you think of your house like a leaky bucket, most New England homes are a leaky bucket, and you're
Either leaking in or leaking out.
Yeah, you're pouring heating or cooling energy into it, and it's just pouring back out. So like, we just did blower door tests on a couple houses we're getting ready to work on. They're like 12, 13 air changes an hour, right? this house we're building in Weston will be less than 1 air change per hour. So that's 13 times more air that's leaking out. You're having to reheat it, recool it. So we tell people, don't start trying to dial up the cheapest way to dial up performance is to stop leaking as much, get the envelope better, and then we dial up the mechanical systems. So, if you're interested in, it's a little overwhelming. So that's why we did a series of this, right? Like, what are ways to think of it? But we typically start with the envelope and then we move to mechanicals. If you start sizing your mechanical systems and your battery systems, or heating systems that are going to be way too big once you improve the envelope of the house, you're going to pay too much money, right? Like, we can cut our mechanical systems down to 1/4 of the size they might be before you dial up the house's performance. So yeah, we try to start like big picture, like look at the house as a system, get it sealed better. If we can add insulation, great. And then dial up the other components. But
so you guys then become the systems integrators, because you start this, you do the analysis, and then begin to, as you put it, size all the mechanicals on that base. So that's really the starting point.
Yeah, heat pumps are becoming, there's great rebates out there now for heat pumps, and a lot of them. So yeah, you want to find a contractor, so if you need help finding a contractor, I don't know, you're in Manchester, you can look, NESE is a great organization, NESEA, and they have, you can find a local NESE contractor that practices this stuff and they'll help you.
I'll put that in the chat.
Yeah. So NESE.org is a great organization for all builders and tradespeople and suppliers and engineers that are really focused on how to do this right.
Okay.
But to your first part of the question, Axel, I mean, there are certain things and that's why this spreadsheet it's kind of intentionally showing you how much is going on, how much orchestration is required. So there, to a certain extent, you can't have one person do it all, but it's good to start with the GC to orchestrate, insulation, mechanicals, electrical upgrades if needed. We primarily stick to renewable and some electrification.
Yeah, well, it's the integration part that is so frightening to me, at least. And I think, I work with the Cape Ann Climate Coalition and in Gloucester, which is centered in Gloucester, but covers Cape Ann. And, what keeps all of this from happening is that most of the housing around here requires retrofitting, and everybody's intimidated by this set of issues, by your spreadsheet, which is very, very sobering, I must say.
Yeah, it doesn't have to be that overwhelming. I think if any process in construction, when you start to map it out, it looks overwhelming. I think part of it is that this is still fairly new, and that the more, right now we're sort of looking at early adopters, the clients that are doing this, they're early adopters on an adoption curve. But as more and more people do this, like if you go, like Malcolm mentioned, the Ford website, like Ford is already advertising that their trucks will power the homes. And so when Ford and GM and all these big manufacturers start pushing this stuff into the mainstream, there'll be a lot more knowledge out there. There'll be a lot more active practitioners. And so, it's just going to take some time. So, but I think 5-10 years from now, this will be much more standard than it is now. It's just right now, it's still pretty new and people are still figuring it out. And there's not as many people have a lot of experience. So, that's, so that we're early on in the electrification of our economy.
Thanks. This has been a great series, and I've passed it on to a lot of other people. And as I said, people are trying to figure it out. And you guys have done a great job in systematically putting out what this is about. Thanks.
Yeah. Well,
Thank you, Axel.
There's another question. I'm not sure if Mass Save has published the new incentives. I think I've seen drafts, but I'm not sure if they're finalized.
Yeah, it's funny. They actually say they'll finalize them by no later than the end of January. That was
the draft. Yeah, the drafts I've seen look great. There's some really good incentives for electrification on 1 to 4 families with much bigger sort of incentives to do this work. So that will also help people, more people will do it, and there'll be more active practitioners out there.
And the best rebates are out there for whole home, displacing your existing system entirely. You don't have to remove it, but you can just switch it off and have it for emergencies, and you can replace everything with air source heat pumps and electric baseboard in the bathrooms, and you do have to cover your whole square footage, but there's some good rebates there.
Yeah, one drawback I saw is that they're really heavily incentivizing oil and propane, but it's less incentives for natural gas. So I was a little disappointed. I was hoping they'd incentive, but you know, they want to go for.
I think that's the piece that they're still waiting on that should be approved, but hasn't been. What's been frustrating for my team is they link these integrated controls for the rebates, and we focus primarily on ductless systems, which I think the integrated controls are much simpler and much more inexpensive if you're just doing if you're taking a ducted furnace, for example, wiping it out and putting in now a ducted heat pump. That's a much more straightforward swap, where the control is very basic. But when you have multiple zone mini split, you now have to put in thousands of dollars worth of controls to get a couple $1,000 rebate. It makes no sense to complicate the system that way for a net zero benefit. So
Yeah.
it's a little bit backwards, but maybe there's room to tweak it.
Yeah, they're always adjusting them. Well, Malcolm, thank you for putting in the time to help put this together. Thank you for attending.
Absolutely. It was my pleasure.
So join us in a few years and we'll have lots of new technology. Malcolm, I'm excited to see when this thing's all up and going. Then we should.
I know.
We'll do another.
Yeah, we'll definitely invite people to the real tour. We did a virtual tour, but the real tour will be fun.
Yeah. All right. Thank you. Good night, people.
Bye, everybody.
Bye-bye.